Question 1. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. The Enterprise Edition supports using policies to lock the user interface to specific tasks. True. Start menu layout can be configured in the Pro Edition using group policy. False. IoT Windows editions are deployed and licensed by the device manufacturer. True. Enterprise, LTSC, and IoT editions are interchangeable in industrial environments. False. Now let's explain these answers so you can clearly understand them. First, the Enterprise Edition supports locking the user interface to specific tasks, and this is true because Enterprise provides granular control through policies. This is especially useful in kiosk scenarios where users should only access limited functions. Next, the statement about configuring the Start menu layout in the Pro Edition is false. This feature is available in Enterprise, not in Pro, since Pro has limited group policy control compared to Enterprise. Moving on, the IoT Windows editions are indeed deployed and licensed by the device manufacturer, which makes this statement true. Manufacturers pre-install IoT editions on purpose-built devices before they are distributed. Finally, the claim that Enterprise LTSC and IoT editions are interchangeable is false. LTSC is managed and installed by the organization for long-term use, while IoT is tied to devices and comes pre-installed by manufacturers. Question 2. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Microsoft Entra ID is part of your infrastructure and must be deployed like a virtual machine. False. Microsoft Entra ID is included by default with Microsoft 365 and Intune subscriptions. True. Each deployment slot in an Azure App Service can have separate authentication settings. True. Cloud App Discovery helps identify on-premises applications with high CPU usage. False. Now let's go through the explanation so you can fully understand these answers. First, the idea that Microsoft Entra ID is part of your infrastructure and must be deployed like a virtual machine is false because Entra ID is a cloud-based identity service provided by Microsoft, not something you install and manage like a VM. Next, it is true that Microsoft Entra ID is included by default with Microsoft 365 and Intune subscriptions. When you subscribe to these services, you automatically get Entra ID free as part of the package. Moving on, the statement about Azure App Service deployment slots having separate authentication settings is true. This means you can configure different authentication for staging and production slots, which helps in testing before moving to live environments. Finally, the claim that Cloud App Discovery identifies on-premises applications with high CPU usage is false, because Cloud App Discovery is actually designed to detect internet-based SaaS apps that users are accessing, not to monitor CPU performance. Question 3. An administrator is assigning access to manage an Azure SQL database using Azure RBAC. They plan to assign the contributor role to an identity object that represents an application. Which type of Microsoft Entra object can be assigned this role? Select one answer. A. Security group. B. Microsoft account. C. Service principal. FD. Organizational unit. The correct answer is Service principal. Now let's go through the explanation so it is clear. Service principals are used to represent applications in Microsoft Entra, and they can be assigned RBAC roles in Azure, which makes them the right answer. Meanwhile, security groups are mainly for grouping users and assigning permissions to people, not applications. A Microsoft account also cannot be assigned Azure RBAC roles, so that option is not valid. And organizational units do not exist in Microsoft Entra ID, so they cannot be considered at all. Question 4. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Modern endpoint management allows IT to manage desktop PCs, mobile devices, and HoloLens using a single unified platform. Tools like Microsoft Intune enable centralized application deployment and compliance enforcement. Now let's move into the explanation so you can understand why these are correct. Modern endpoint management goes beyond traditional approaches by allowing IT to handle desktops, mobile devices, and even HoloLens, all from one unified system. This makes it possible to apply consistent policies across a wide variety of devices. Additionally, Microsoft Intune plays a big role because it enables centralized application deployment and compliance enforcement. This means apps and policies can be pushed out and managed from one place rather than relying on older methods. For example, traditional GPO policies or manual USB-based deployments are considered outdated because they are limited in scope and harder to manage at scale. That is why the correct answers for question 4 are desktop PCs, mobile devices, and HoloLens, and centralized application deployment and compliance enforcement. Question 5. Arrange the following steps in the correct sequence of the enterprise desktop lifecycle. The correct order is planning, purchasing, deployment, operations, support, and upgrade and retire. Now let's go through the explanation so you can understand why this order is correct. The cycle begins with planning, where the organization develops a strategy and sets requirements for devices and systems. After planning, the next step is purchasing, which ensures that the right hardware and software are acquired to meet those requirements. Once devices are purchased, deployment comes next, where they are set up, configured, and rolled out to users. Following deployment, the operations phase ensures that systems continue running smoothly and securely on a day-to-day basis. After operations, support plays a key role by providing troubleshooting, training, and assistance to end users. Finally, the upgrade and retire phase closes the cycle, replacing aging devices with newer ones or removing them from service entirely. Question 6. For each data migration method or tool, drag it to the appropriate boxes in the correct match column based on its function. Seamlessly migrates local user folders to the cloud, known folder move, KFM, captures and transfers user accounts, files, and settings, user state migration tool, USMT, transfers user profiles using Cloud Sync during sign-in, enterprise state roaming, avoids the need for reimagining by preserving user data, in-place upgrade. Now let's move on to the explanation so you understand why each match is correct. Known folder move, or KFM, moves common folders like desktop, documents, and pictures into OneDrive so users can continue accessing them even after deployment. The User State Migration Tool, or USMT, is designed to capture user profiles, application settings, and files before a Windows upgrade, and then restore them afterward. Enterprise state roaming works differently by syncing user profiles and settings to the cloud using Azure Active Directory, which lets users access their personalized environment across multiple devices. Finally, an in-place upgrade preserves existing data and apps while upgrading the operating system, so users don't lose their information or require a full reimage. Question 7. For each Windows device form factor, drag it to its correct description in the correct match column. High performance, used in environments like CAD, desktop PC, more ergonomic for mobile users when combined with peripherals, laptop, converts from a laptop to a tablet, popular for users who type frequently. Hybrid, primarily used for entertainment and gaming. Xbox, used for meetings with large format touchscreen. Surface Hub. Now let's explain why these matches are correct. Desktop PCs are chosen for high-performance tasks such as CAD, where powerful computing is required. Laptops, on the other hand, are best for mobile users and remote work, especially when combined with external peripherals for comfort. Hybrids combine the functionality of tablets and laptops, making them a great option for users who need frequent typing but still want portability. Xbox is specifically designed for entertainment and gaming, not productivity or enterprise work. Finally, the Surface Hub is a collaborative device equipped with a large touchscreen, making it ideal for meetings and team discussions. Question 8. What is the default behavior when creating an Azure subscription using a Microsoft account? Select one answer. A. No Microsoft Entra tenant is created unless added manually. B. An Entra tenant is created with the name default directory. C. The account is added to an existing organizational tenant. D. A hybrid tenant linked to your on-premises AD is provisioned. The correct answer is B. An Entra tenant is created with the name default directory. When you create an Azure subscription using a Microsoft account, a new Entra tenant is automatically provisioned, and by default, it is called default directory. Option A is wrong because the tenant is not left out. It is created automatically. Option C is only true if you are joining an existing organization's subscription, which is not the default case. Option D is also incorrect because a hybrid tenant requires deliberate configuration with on-premises Active Directory, and this does not happen by default. Question 9. What does the term tenant represent in the context of Microsoft Entra ID? Select one answer. A. An application definition registered within the directory. B. A cloud-based domain controller instance. C. An individual Microsoft Entra directory instance. D. A user object with administrator rights. The correct answer is C. An individual Microsoft Entra directory instance. A tenant refers to a specific instance of Microsoft Entra that an organization uses for identity and access management. Option A is incorrect because an application definition only defines an app within the directory, not the tenant itself. Option B is wrong because Microsoft Entra does not use domain controllers. It is a managed cloud service. Option D is also incorrect because a user object with admin rights is just a role assignment inside the tenant, not the tenant itself. Question 10. Which statement is true about Microsoft Entra Join? Select one answer. A. It is limited to organizations with fewer than 500 users. B. Only cloud-only environments can use Microsoft Entra Join. C. It is suitable for organizations of any size and type. D. It requires all users to be in the same geographic region. The correct answer is C. It is suitable for organizations of any size and type. Microsoft Entra Join has no restrictions based on size or type of organization. It is designed to support a wide range of business models, from small businesses to large enterprises. Option A is incorrect because there is no user limit imposed on Entra Join. Option B is wrong because while it works well in cloud-first environments, it is also supported in hybrid setups. Option D is not true because there are no geographic restrictions tied to using Entra Join. Question 11. Which two behaviors occur when a Windows device is joined to Microsoft Entra ID from the OB setup screen? Select two answers. A. The device automatically installs all required Windows updates. B. A federated user is redirected to their organization's STS login page. C. The user must first install the Microsoft Entra connector. D. Microsoft Entra ID checks whether MDM enrollment is required. E. All local accounts are deleted from the device. The correct answers are B. A federated user is redirected to their organization's STS login page. And D. Microsoft Entra ID checks whether MDM enrollment is required. Now let's go through the explanation step by step so it becomes clear. To begin with, Option A is incorrect because Windows Update is a separate process and is not triggered automatically during the join process. Moving on, Option B is correct since federated users are redirected to their organization's STS login page as part of the join flow. Next, Option C is wrong because users do not need to install the Microsoft Entra connector to complete device join during setup. Furthermore, Option D is correct because Microsoft Entra ID evaluates whether MDM enrollment, such as Intune, is required during the join process. Lastly, Option E is incorrect because local accounts are not deleted during Entra join. Therefore, the correct answers are B and D. For example, if a company uses a federated identity provider, users will automatically be redirected to their login portal, and at the same time, Entra checks whether device management enrollment needs to happen. Question 12. For each Configuration Manager client deployment method, drag it to the correct description. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Deploys during Windows installation using task sequences. Correct match is OS deployment. uses ccmsetup.exe and install parameters in a script. Correct match is manual deployment. Automatically installs client to discovered devices via AD. Correct match is client push. Enables modern co-management via Cloud Management Gateway. Correct match is Microsoft Intune. Now let's move on to the explanation, so this becomes very clear. First of all, OS deployment is correct because task sequences during Windows setup are commonly used to install the Configuration Manager client, especially on new or rebuilt devices. Secondly, manual deployment is correct since administrators can use the ccmsetup.exe file with parameters in a script to install the client manually. Next, client push is the right answer because from the Configuration Manager console, the client is automatically pushed to Active Directory discovered devices over the network. Furthermore, Microsoft Intune is correct because it facilitates co-management, allowing devices to be managed both in Configuration Manager and Intune through Cloud Management Gateway. On the other hand, USB deployment and Microsoft Store for Business are not valid options, since they are not recognized deployment methods for the Configuration Manager client. Question 13. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. The Configuration Manager client can provide hardware inventory data to administrators. True. Client push increases network traffic during deployment. True. Manual deployment is best suited for fast, large-scale deployments. False. Microsoft Intune can install the client and enable co-management via CMG. True. Now let's go through the explanation together, so you see why these are the correct choices. First, the Configuration Manager client providing hardware inventory data is true, because one of its core benefits is collecting both hardware and software information for administrators. Secondly, client push increasing network traffic is also true, since files are copied over the network, which can create significant traffic when deploying at scale. On the other hand, the statement that manual deployment is best suited for fast, large-scale deployments is false, because manual installs are slower and not practical for broad rollouts unless automation is applied. Finally, the statement about Microsoft Intune is true since Intune can install the client and register it with the Cloud Management Gateway, enabling modern co-management. Question 14. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. The client push method discovers devices using Active Directory integration and installs the client by copying files over the network. The manual deployment method involves using a script and the ccmsetup.exe installer or MSI file. Now let's go through the explanation clearly. First, client push is correct because this method installs clients directly from the Configuration Manager console, and it relies on Active Directory integration to discover devices. Secondly, copying files over the network is accurate, since this is how the installation files are delivered in client push deployments. Next, manual deployment is correct because it describes the non-automated method where administrators run a script for installation. Finally, ccmsetup.exe is correct as it is the main executable used in manual installs, whether through a script or MSI. Question 15. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Audit logs in Intune can be filtered and retrieved for up to 1 year. True. Devices registered with Microsoft Entra ID but not enrolled in Intune appear in the Intune Admin Center. False. Enterprise state roaming lets devices sync settings and app data across different platforms. True. The All Devices section under Devices in Intune shows domain-joined devices not enrolled in Intune. False. Now let's explain this step by step. First, the statement about audit logs is true because Intune allows audit logs to be filtered and retrieved through the portal or Graph API for up to 1 year. Secondly, the statement about devices registered with Entra ID but not enrolled in Intune is false, since only devices that are actually enrolled appear in the Intune Admin Center. Next, enterprise state roaming is true because it enables users to sync settings and app data across multiple devices and platforms within allowed groups. Finally, the statement about the All Devices section is false because that view in Intune only shows devices that are enrolled in Intune, not just domain-joined or Entra-registered ones. Question 16. For each Microsoft Entra device management concept, drag it to the appropriate boxes in the correct match column to match it against its description in the option column. Mobile device management solution used with Microsoft Entra ID. Correct match is Microsoft Intune. Legacy management system based on group policy and imaging. Correct match is Microsoft Configuration Manager. Must be manually enabled to support group policy for Entra-joined devices. Correct match is Microsoft Entra Domain Services. Automatically enrolls devices during Entra-join if integration is configured. Correct match is Microsoft Intune. Microsoft Intune is the correct choice for mobile device management because it integrates with Entra ID and supports automatic enrollment when configured. Microsoft Configuration Manager is correct for legacy environments since it uses ADDS and group policy with imaging-based methods. Microsoft Entra Domain Services must be manually enabled to extend group policy support to Entra-joined devices, though it does not support mobile platforms. Microsoft Intune is again correct for automatic enrollment since devices can auto-enroll during Entra-join when the feature is set up. Question 17. Arrange the phases of the mobile device management lifecycle in the correct order. The correct order is enroll, configure, protect, retire. The lifecycle begins with enroll, where devices are first registered with Intune so they can be managed. After enrollment comes configure, when administrators apply security policies and compliance settings to those devices. Next is protect, which ensures ongoing security by monitoring compliance and deploying updates. Finally, the retire phase occurs when a device is no longer needed, lost, or stolen, and at this point, Intune can wipe corporate data or reset the device to protect information. Question 18. Which two statements are true about Microsoft Entra Hybrid Join? Select two answers. A. It enables automatic registration of on-premises domain-joined devices with Microsoft Entra ID. B. It supports Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows 8.1 non-home editions. C. It supports Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP. D. It works even if a single forest synchronizes with multiple Microsoft Entra tenants. E. It requires group policy to function. The correct answers are A. It enables automatic registration of on-premises domain-joined devices with Microsoft Entra ID. And B. It supports Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows 8.1 non-home editions. Automatic registration is the main purpose of Entra Hybrid Join, allowing on-premises domain-joined devices to be registered seamlessly with Entra ID. Supported operating systems include Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows 8.1 non-home editions, provided they are configured correctly. In contrast, Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP are outdated and not supported. Hybrid Join also does not allow a single forest to synchronize with multiple tenants because this would create identity conflicts. Finally, group policy is not required for Hybrid Join to function, though some organizations may choose to use it for configuration management. Question 19. Your help desk reports that a device isn't receiving updates and they suspect the Configuration Manager client is offline. You check the console and see that it hasn't sent a ping to its assigned management point in over 6 minutes. What is the client's online status? Select one answer. A. The client is considered online. B. The client is considered inactive. C. The client has failed hardware inventory. D. The client is considered offline. The correct answer is D. The client is considered offline. The client is marked offline if it fails to send ping-like messages within 5 minutes, which means after 6 minutes without communication, it is considered offline. Option A is incorrect because being online requires ping responses within that 5-minute window. Option B is wrong since inactivity is evaluated over a 7-day period, not a few minutes. Option C is unrelated because hardware inventory status has nothing to do with online or offline state. Question 20. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. In Intune, PowerShell scripts can be deployed to Windows devices, while shell scripts are used for macOS devices. Now I will explain why these are correct. Firstly, PowerShell scripts are supported via the Intune management extension on Windows. For example, an administrator might deploy a PowerShell script to update registry settings or install an application automatically after hours. Furthermore, shell scripts are the macOS equivalent and are used to configure or automate actions on managed Macs. For instance, deploying a shell script to set a VPN profile or adjust system preferences during enrollment. Therefore, use PowerShell scripts for Windows device tasks and shell scripts for macOS device tasks. Question 21. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Roaming user profiles sync settings only when the user signs out. True. Enterprise state roaming can sync both desktop app and UWP app settings. False. Mandatory user profiles retain all user changes between sessions. False. Enterprise state roaming encrypts data in transit and at rest using Azure RMS. True. Now let's explain why these answers are correct, so it's clear and concise. Firstly, roaming user profiles save changes to the network location only at signout. Therefore, the statement is true because simultaneous sign-ins can cause overwrites. Secondly, enterprise state roaming does not cover traditional desktop application settings. Consequently, the claim that it syncs both desktop and UWP app settings is false, since ESR only supports UWP app settings and Windows settings. Thirdly, mandatory user profiles discard user changes at signout, so they do not retain all changes between sessions. Hence, that statement is false. Finally, enterprise state roaming uses Azure Rights Management to protect data both in transit and at rest, so the encryption statement is true. Question 22. You are an Intune administrator reviewing reports of a device not applying a configuration policy. You confirm the policy is assigned but not enforced. You suspect either a sync delay or a platform check-in issue. What 2 steps could help you troubleshoot the problem? Select 2 answers. A. Force a device sync from the Microsoft Intune Admin Center. B. Wait 24 hours for the device to auto-sync. C. Use the company portal app to trigger a manual check-in. D. Delete and recreate the policy. E. Assign the policy to all Microsoft Entra groups. The correct answers are A. Force a device sync from the Microsoft Intune Admin Center, and C. Use the company portal app to trigger a manual check-in. Now I will explain why these 2 are the right troubleshooting steps. Forcing a device sync from the Intune Admin Center initiates an immediate check-in. Therefore, pending policies can be applied right away rather than waiting for the next automatic interval. Moreover, using the company portal app lets an end user trigger a manual check-in on the device, consequently confirming whether the problem is a platform check-in or a broader policy distribution issue. For example, an admin can push a sync and ask the user to open company portal to sync. If the policy installs immediately, the issue was a delayed check-in. Otherwise, further investigation is needed into platform or compliance errors. Question 23. Which profile extension should be used for a roaming profile on Windows 10 version 1903? Select one answer. A v5, B v6, C v7. The correct answer is B v6. Now I will explain why v6 is the right choice and why the others are not. Firstly, Windows 10 versions from 1607 through 1909, which includes 1903, require the v6 profile extension to ensure the roaming profile is recognized and used correctly. Consequently, choosing .v6 guarantees compatibility. Conversely, v5 is only for much earlier Windows 10 builds such as 1507 and 1511, so using it would cause profile mismatches. Furthermore, V7 does not apply in this context, as there is no V7 profile extension for these Windows versions. Therefore, specifying .v6 in your profile path, for example, fileserver-profile sent username sent.v6, ensures users on 1903 receive the correct roaming profile behavior and avoid profile loading issues. Question 24. Match each platform-specific Intune script setting with its correct platform or requirement, requires version 1607 or later, and Entra ID joined. Correct match is Windows, requires shell interpreter and devices managed by Intune. Correct match is Mac OS, uses PowerShell and supports 64-bit execution setting. Correct match is Windows. Supports retry on failure and script frequency options. Correct match is Mac OS. Now, I will explain these matches so it's clear. Firstly, Windows scripts require Windows 10 version 1607 or later, and a device joined to Microsoft Entra ID because the Intune management extension depends on those OS and identity capabilities. For example, an admin deploying a PowerShell script to change a registry key needs that modern Windows platform. Secondly, macOS scripts require a shell interpreter, and that the device is managed by Intune, since macOS uses Bash or ZSH to run the script payloads, so administrators commonly deploy shell scripts to configure VPN or system preferences on Macs. Moreover, Windows supports PowerShell with an option to choose 64-bit execution, which matters when a script must access 64-bit system locations or registry paths. Therefore, selecting 64-bit avoids redirection issues. Finally, macOS script settings include retry on failure and frequency controls not present in the Windows script settings, enabling more resilient scheduling for occasional transient failures on managed Macs. Question 25. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. You can assign apps to devices that aren't enrolled in Intune. True, Intune can manage both built-in apps and web apps. True, conditional access can block apps on jailbroken devices. True, app lifecycle in Intune ends after the app is deployed. False. Now I will explain these answers so it's clear. Firstly, Intune can assign apps to unenrolled devices by using app protection policies for users, so administrators can protect corporate data even when the device isn't fully enrolled. Moreover, Intune supports multiple app types. For example, built-in OS apps, line of business apps, store apps, and web apps, so managing both built-in and web apps is true. Consequently, conditional access can block access from jailbroken or rooted devices by evaluating device health signals and enforcing policies, for instance, preventing corporate email access from an insecure phone. Finally, the app lifecycle does not end at deployment. Rather, it continues with configuration, protection, updates, monitoring, and eventual retirement. Therefore, the statement that it ends after deployment is false. Question 26. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. The Intune management extension is required to deploy Win32 apps in Intune, and the return codes configuration is used to define the outcome of the installation process. Now the explanation. Firstly, the Intune management extension is the agent that downloads and runs Win32 app packages on Windows devices. Therefore, you need it installed on the device to deploy traditional MSI or EXE installers via Intune. Moreover, return codes are configured to map installer exit codes to outcomes such as success, failure, or reboot required. So, for example, you might map 0 to success and 3010 to success with reboot to ensure correct post-install behavior. Consequently, using the Intune management extension, together with well-defined return code mappings, ensures reliable Win32 app deployment and accurate reporting in the Intune console. Question 27. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Microsoft Store for Business allows bulk procurement of apps. True. After June 15, 2023, Intune still manages offline store apps with full support. False. Modern Microsoft Store integration in Intune supports Win32 apps. True. Client devices must support Microsoft Intune Management Extension to install store apps. True. Now let's explain each answer succinctly so it's clear and ready for narration. Firstly, Microsoft Store for Business lets organizations acquire apps in volume for enterprise use. Consequently, bulk procurement is supported. Secondly, after June 15, 2023, Intune no longer provides full management support for store apps, even if the apps remain on devices. Therefore, the statement is false. Thirdly, the modern Microsoft Store integration in Intune does support Win32 Store apps in preview with current integrations, so that statement is true. Finally, devices require the Intune management extension to install Microsoft Store apps via Intune, hence that statement is true. Question 28. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Apps that share the same name will both appear in the company portal. False. You can assign Microsoft Store apps to all users or all devices using the required option. True. The publisher field must be manually entered during app creation. False. The automatic update feature reduces the need for manual updates. True. Now I will explain these answers so it's clear. First, apps that share the same name will not both appear in the company portal. Consequently, only one app with a duplicate name is shown. Therefore, the statement is false. Moreover, the required assignment option does allow admins to deploy apps to all users or all devices automatically. Hence, that statement is true. However, the publisher field is pre-populated from Microsoft Store metadata and does not need to be entered manually, so that claim is false. Finally, the automatic update feature reduces the need for manual updates because updates are pushed centrally and applied on devices. Therefore, that statement is true. Question 29. Arrange the steps to deploy an app to a non-enrolled device in the correct order. Instruction. Drag and drop the items into the correct order, starting with the first step at the top. Sign in to the Endpoint Administrator Admin Center. Select Apps, All Apps. Choose an app that supports assignment to non-enrolled devices. Edit the assignments and select Available with or without enrollment. Select the appropriate user group. Select Review plus Save, then click Save. Now I'm going to explain these steps so you can follow the workflow easily. First, sign in to the Endpoint Administrator Admin Center so you can access the app catalog and assignment controls. Consequently, you'll be able to manage apps centrally. Next, select Apps, then All Apps to see the list of available apps and pick the one you want to make available to non-enrolled devices. Then, choose an app that supports assignment to non-enrolled devices because not every app type allows assignments without enrollment. After that, edit the assignments and choose Available with or without enrollment so users who haven't enrolled can still install the app via the company portal. Subsequently, select the appropriate user group to target the correct audience, which ensures only intended users see the app. Finally, select Review plus Save, and then click Save to publish the assignment and trigger availability for those non-enrolled users. Question 30. For each Microsoft 365 deployment method, drag it to the description that best matches its usage and capabilities. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Offers full control and scales well for enterprise environments. Correct. Configuration Manager. A web-based tool for generating configuration XML files. Correct. Office Customization Tool. Can download Office files for local deployment. Correct. Office Deployment Tool. Easiest method, but provides the least administrative control. Correct. End-user installation. Enables creation and editing of deployment config files without coding. Correct. Web-based config generator. Now I will explain these matches so everything is clear and ready for narration. Configuration Manager is the enterprise-grade option and therefore offers full control and scale for large organizations. For example, it integrates with existing imaging and patching workflows so IT can centrally manage installs and updates. Meanwhile, the Office Customization Tool is a web-based utility that generates XML configuration files, so administrators can quickly build tailored install configurations without hand-editing XML. Furthermore, The Office Deployment tool actually downloads Office installation files for local deployment, which is useful when you want to host installers on a network share or control updates centrally. Consequently, end-user installation is the simplest path because users install from the Microsoft 365 portal themselves. However, this gives the least administrative control and relies on user action and permissions. Moreover, the web-based config generator lets you create and edit deployment configuration files without coding, which speeds up the creation of deployment XML for ODT and reduces manual errors. Question 31. Match each Win32 app preparation step to its correct tool action. Validate installation commands, manual testing, create.intune win package, intune win app util.exe, specify installer source folder, command line parameter. Now I will explain why each match is correct so you can package reliably. Firstly, validate installation commands by manual testing because you must confirm the installer switches and silent options work on a clean machine. Consequently, this prevents failed deployments when the package runs at scale. Secondly, create the .intune win package using intune win app util.exe, since this official tool wraps the installer and its files into the single archive Intune requires for Win32 app delivery. Moreover, it captures the installer, detection logic, and dependencies in one package. Finally, specify the installer source folder with a command line parameter. For example, the bash s parameter to intune win app util or your packaging script. Therefore, the packager points the tool to the exact location of MSI or exe files to include. For instance, when packaging 7-zip, you would test the install command, run intune win app util.exe -c source 7-zip, and verify installation succeeds on a test VM. Question 32. What is one advantage of using Intune app protection policies over uninstalling managed apps from a device? Select one answer. A. It blocks app usage entirely instead of deleting the app. B. It removes all user data, including contacts and media. C. It disables the operating system until re-enrollment. D. It wipes company data while leaving personal app data intact. The correct answer is D. It wipes company data while leaving personal app data intact. Now let's explain why D is the right choice. Firstly, app protection policies target only corporate data within managed apps, so personal photos, contacts, and other user content remain untouched. Consequently, this preserves user privacy on BYOD devices. Moreover, this approach is less disruptive than uninstalling apps or doing a full device wipe, and therefore it reduces user downtime while still protecting sensitive information. For example, if an employee leaves the company, the admin can selectively remove corporate mail and documents from the Outlook and OneDrive apps without erasing the user's personal photos or apps on the same phone. Finally, because app protection enforces data controls, such as preventing copy-paste to unmanaged apps and requiring app-level encryption, it achieves security goals without the collateral damage of removing user-owned content. Question 33. Which type of device is not supported for deploying Win32 apps using Intune? Select one answer. A. Microsoft Entra joined device. B. Group policy enrolled device. C. Hybrid domain joined device. D. Non-managed BYOD device. The correct answer is D. Non-managed BYOD device. Intune deploys Win32 apps only to devices that are managed and appropriately joined or enrolled. For example, Entra joined, hybrid joined, or devices using group policy with the Intune management extension. Consequently, personal devices that are not enrolled or managed, BYODs without enrollment, cannot receive Win32 app deployments via Intune. Therefore, choose D because non-managed BYOD devices are unsupported for Win32 app delivery. Question 34. Which two application types can be deployed using both Configuration Manager and Microsoft Intune? Select two answers. A. Store apps. B. AppV. C. MSI. D. Intune Win. E. Office C2R. The correct answers are C. MSI and E. Office C2R. Now let's explain why those two are correct and why the others aren't. Firstly, MSI is supported by both platforms. Consequently, traditional Windows installers, packaged as MSI files, can be deployed via Configuration Manager and also distributed through Intune, albeit with some Intune limitations on advanced parameters. Moreover, Office Click to Run, Office C2R, is supported by both Configuration Manager and Intune, so organizations can deploy Microsoft 365 apps using either tool depending on their management model. Conversely, Store apps are primarily an Intune capability, AppV is specific to Configuration Manager, and Intune Win is an Intune packaging format only. Therefore, those options don't apply to both products simultaneously. Question 35. You want to ensure Microsoft Office is installed automatically for every user who logs onto a set of lab computers. The installation must occur regardless of the user's identity, and Office should always be available. Select one answer. A. Assign the software to users. B. Publish the software to users. C. Assign the software to computers. D. Publish the software to computers. The correct answer is C. Assign the software to computers. Now I will explain why C is correct and why the others are not. Assigning the software to computers installs Office at startup and ensures the application is present for every user who signs in on those machines. Therefore, it meets the requirement that installation occur regardless of user identity. Conversely, assigning the software to users installs per user when that user signs in, so it does not guarantee availability for every account on a lab machine. Moreover, publishing to users or computers only makes the app available for manual installation and does not enforce automatic installation. Hence, publishing does not meet the always available requirement. Question 36. Your team modifies an MSI installation file used in a group policy object, GPO. You need to ensure the new version is applied without completely creating a new deployment. What should you do? Select one answer. A. Remove the GPO and create a new one. B. Reassign the MSI under a different name. C. Redeploy the existing MSI through the same GPO. D. Convert the MSI to a .intune win package for Intune. The correct answer is C. Redeploy the existing MSI through the same GPO. Now let's explain why C is correct and why the others are not. First of all, redeploying the modified MSI through the same GPO will cause clients to see the updated package and apply the changes according to the existing software deployment rules. Therefore, you avoid extra administrative overhead and preserve the original deployment settings. Secondly, removing the GPO and creating a new one is unnecessary and introduces complexity, whereas redeploying keeps the same assignment and targets intact. Moreover, reassigning the MSI under a different name is only needed when the package structure has fundamentally changed. Consequently, it's not required for a standard version update and can create needless confusion. Finally, converting the MSI to a .intune win is an option only if you plan to move to Intune. However, it does not help when you simply want to update the MSI via your existing GPO deployment. Question 37. Arrange the following steps in the correct order to successfully deploy an app using Microsoft Intune. Instruction: drag and drop the items into the correct order, starting with the first step at the top. Correct order is: ensure Intune supports the app, create Microsoft Entra groups for targeting, add the app to Intune and assign it, configure app configuration and protection policies, monitor app deployment and installation status. Now I will explain the sequence so it's easy to follow. First, ensure Intune supports the app, because otherwise you'll waste effort packaging or assigning a type that the platform can't manage. Consequently, check supported app types and any platform prerequisites before you begin. Next, create Microsoft Entra groups for targeting, since grouping users or devices ahead of time makes assignments predictable and reduces rework. Moreover, using dynamic groups can simplify ongoing targeting. Then, add the app to Intune and assign it to the prepared groups so devices or users receive the deployment. Therefore, choose the correct install type and assignment scope during this step. After that, configure app configuration and protection policies to enforce settings and data controls, and furthermore apply app protection for BYOD scenarios to protect corporate data without invading personal data. Finally, monitor app deployment and installation status, because telemetry shows success rates and failure reasons, which lets you remediate issues such as detection rule failures or missing prerequisites. Question 38. Fill in the blanks with the correct options from the drop-down menus. Microsoft Entra ID protection defines risk levels as low, medium, and high, and allows you to take actions like requiring MFA or blocking access based on those levels. Now let's explain why these choices are right. First, Microsoft Entra ID protection classifies sign-in risk into 3 defined tiers: low, medium, and high, so administrators can apply graduated responses to suspicious activity. Consequently, risk policies can enforce actions such as requiring multi-factor authentication or blocking access when risk reaches configured thresholds. For example, if a sign-in from an unfamiliar location is evaluated as high risk, the policy can require MFA or deny access, thereby reducing the chance of account compromise. Question 39. What is one key advantage of always-on VPN compared to traditional VPN solutions? Select one answer. A. It requires no infrastructure components. B. It can only be deployed on Windows Server 2012 R2 or earlier. C. It allows VPN connections to be automatically established before users sign in. Correct? D. It depends solely on Active Directory group policy for configuration. Now I will explain why C is correct and the others are not. Firstly, Always-on VPN can establish the device's VPN connection automatically before a user signs in. Therefore, device-level management and policy enforcement, such as patching or conditional access, can run at startup rather than waiting for the user to log on. Moreover, this improves security for remote or roaming devices because updates and compliance checks happen earlier in the boot process. However, option A is wrong because Always-on VPN does require infrastructure components like certificate services, DNS, and an NPS or VPN gateway. Similarly, option B is incorrect since Always-on VPN is supported on modern Windows Server and client versions, not limited to older servers. Finally, option D is false because configuration can use Intune, provisioning packages, or VPN profiles, not only group policy. Question 40. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Always-on VPN can be deployed on Windows 10 or 11 and supports device and user authentication. Unlike direct access, it does not require group policy for configuration. Now I will explain these answers so it's clear and ready for narration. First, Always-on VPN is supported on modern Windows desktop versions such as Windows 10 and 11. Consequently, you should target those OS builds when planning deployments so clients can use the built-in VPN platform. Secondly, it supports both device and user authentication. Therefore, you can configure a device tunnel that connects before sign-in and a user tunnel that connects after sign-in to enforce policies at both stages. Moreover, unlike direct access, which relied heavily on group policy, Always-on VPN can be provisioned via Intune, Configuration Manager, provisioning packages, or PowerShell, so administrators can use cloud or script-driven workflows. For example, deploy an Intune VPN profile that establishes a device tunnel at boot, so patching and conditional access checks run immediately on remote laptops. Question 41. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Intune audit logs are disabled by default and must be manually enabled. False. The Intune Admin Center includes built-in device inventory reports in the Reports node. You can generate app reports in Intune and export them as CSV files. True. Microsoft Graph API supports retrieving installation states of apps on user devices. True. Now I will explain these answers so the logic is clear and easy to narrate. Firstly, the audit log statement is false because Intune audit logging is enabled by default for tenants. Therefore, admins already have activity logs available in the portal. However, the claim about a generic reports node is false because device and app inventory are accessed from the devices or apps areas of the admin center rather than a single built-in device inventory report under reports. Furthermore, app reports are available and can be exported as CSV for offline analysis, For example, exporting failed install rows to filter by error code and prioritize fixes. Consequently, Microsoft Graph can be used to retrieve installation states programmatically by querying device and app endpoints, enabling automation or custom dashboards that surface install success and failure across your estate. Question 42. Which 3 filters can be applied when generating a device compliance report in Microsoft Intune? Select 3 answers: A, OS, B, compliance status, C, device name, D, platform, E, ownership. Correct answers: A, OS, B, compliance status, E, ownership. Now I will explain these answers and why they matter. First, filtering by OS is useful because administrators often need focused compliance data for specific operating systems. Therefore, you might run a Windows 10 compliance report to check update or BitLocker status on that population. Moreover, filtering by compliance status lets you isolate compliant versus non-compliant devices quickly. Hence, you can prioritize remediation for devices failing critical checks, such as antivirus or encryption. Furthermore, ownership helps differentiate corporate-owned devices from personal BYOD devices, so consequently policies and remediation actions can be tailored appropriately for each ownership type. In contrast, device name is not a supported compliance report filter, and platform is available elsewhere in app reporting. Therefore, they are not part of the standard device compliance report filter set. Question 43. For each compliance concept, drag it to the appropriate boxes in the correct match column to match it against its description in the option column. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Policy area where encryption and password requirements are defined. Answer: device compliance policy, action that sends a customized email to the user. Answer: email notification. Action that assigns a grace period before enforcing a compliance block. Answer: grace period enforcement, service that uses compliance status to determine access. Answer: conditional access. I will now explain each answer. First, device compliance policy is where admins set rules like password complexity, encryption, OS version, and threat levels. So this is exactly where those requirements live. For example, requiring BitLocker and a strong PIN before a laptop is considered compliant. Next, email notification is a non-compliance action that automatically sends tailored guidance to the user. Therefore, it is the tool that alerts them with steps to remediate, such as updating the OS or enabling encryption. Then, grace period enforcement intentionally delays blocking access, thereby giving users time to fix issues. For instance, allowing 24 hours to install a critical update without immediate disruption. Finally, conditional access evaluates signals from Microsoft Entra ID, including device compliance status. Consequently, it decides whether a sign-in to resources like Exchange Online is permitted only when the device is compliant. Question 44. Arrange the following steps to determine whether an application is installed on a user's device using Microsoft Graph API. Instruction: drag and drop the items into the correct order, starting with the first step at the top. Step 1, get a list of devices registered to a user from Microsoft Entra ID. Step 2, view the list of applications in the tenant. Step 3, retrieve the application ID from the app list. Step 4, query the device installation status using the application ID. I will now explain each step. First, you start with the user's devices because installation status is evaluated per device, so you must know exactly which devices belong to the user. Next, you list tenant applications to find the target app object exists in your environment, ensuring you are working with the correct app definition rather than a display name. Then, you pull the application ID, since Graph endpoints require that unique identifier to reference the app precisely across calls. Finally, you query installation status using that app ID against each of the user's devices, which returns whether the app is installed or not. For example, if support needs to confirm whether Company Portal is on Jordan's laptop, you first fetch Jordan's devices, then list apps, grab Company Portal's app ID, and lastly, ask Graph for the install status on that laptop, completing the dependency-driven sequence cleanly. Question 45. Which two platforms support compliance policies in Intune? Select two answers. Option A, Windows 7. Option B, Android Enterprise. Option C, Linux. Option D, Mac OS. Correct answers. B, Android Enterprise and Intune. I will now explain each choice. First, Android Enterprise is fully supported for Intune compliance policies, so admins can require settings like device encryption, passcode strength, and OS version on corporate or work profile devices. Next, macOS is also supported, enabling policies such as file vault encryption and minimum operating system versions. Therefore, it qualifies as a correct platform. Conversely, Windows 7 is not eligible because Intune compliance support begins with Windows 8.1 and later. Thus, Windows 7 falls outside the supported range. Finally, Linux is not currently a supported platform for Intune compliance policies, so it cannot meet the requirement here. In real life, this means conditional access can allow only compliant Android Enterprise phones and macOS devices into apps like Outlook, while Windows 7 or Linux devices would be blocked until they meet organizational standards. Question 46. For each statement below, indicate whether it is true or false. EFS uses AES 256-bit encryption by default. Answer, true. Group policy can be used to encrypt the Windows page file. Answer, true. BitLocker protects hibernation, paging files, and OS data. Answer, EFS encrypts files during SMB network transfer by default. Answer, false. I will now explain each answer. First, EFS defaults to AES 256-bit, so when you encrypt a file with EFS, it uses strong symmetric encryption out of the box. Next, the Windows page file can indeed be encrypted centrally because group policy or local security policy enables page file encryption, thereby protecting spillover memory on disk. Moreover, BitLocker encrypts the entire volume. Consequently, the operating system data, the paging file, and the hibernation file are covered once the drive is protected. However, EFS only secures data at rest on the local disk. When that file is accessed over SMB, it is decrypted before transit unless you add a transport layer like IPsec or use WebDAV over HTTPS, so the default network transfer is not encrypted by EFS. Question 47. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. Windows Defender Application Control blocks execution of unsigned scripts and apps unless a policy file explicitly allows them. These policy files can be deployed to Windows Enterprise PCs. I will now explain each answer. First, WDAC works from an allow list, and that allow list lives in a signed policy file. Therefore, anything not explicitly permitted by that file will be blocked by default. Next, deployment targets the Enterprise editions because they include the management features needed to enforce WDAC at scale, such as central policy distribution via Intune or group policy. Consequently, Windows Enterprise PCs is the correct scope. For example, an organization can sign a WDAC policy that permits only Microsoft Office, Edge, and a line of business app, then deploy that policy to all enterprise laptops, so unknown scripts and apps never launch, unless the policy file says they can. Question 48. Which two features are provided by Microsoft Defender Antivirus? Select two answers. Option A, enable cloud-delivered malware definitions. Option B, quarantine suspicious files after scan. Option C, manage NTFS permissions. Option D, configure TCP/IP subnet masks. Correct answers. A, enable cloud-delivered malware definitions. B, quarantine suspicious files after scan. I will now explain each choice. First, Defender uses cloud-delivered protection to pull the latest intelligence from Microsoft Service, thereby improving zero-day and fast-moving threat detection beyond local signatures. Next, when a scan detects a threat, Defender moves the item into quarantine so it cannot run while an admin reviews or restores it if needed, which prevents immediate execution and spread. However, managing NTFS permissions belongs to file system administration, not antivirus capabilities, so option C is not provided by Defender. Likewise, configuring TCP or IP subnet masks is a networking task unrelated to anti-malware. Therefore, option D is incorrect. In practice, This means Defender quickly learns about new malware from the cloud and safely isolates anything suspicious it finds on a device until you decide the final action. Question 49. For each statement below, indicate whether it is true or false. Conditional access app controls support session controls for on-premises apps. Answer: true. You can only apply session controls to featured SaaS apps listed in the Microsoft catalog. Answer: false. Session controls require configuration using Microsoft Entra ID. Answer: true. You must reassign admin roles to access session control for each app. Answer: false. I will now explain each answer. First, conditional access app control can broker sessions for on-premises apps when they are published through Entra application proxy. Therefore, session controls do apply to those apps. Conversely, it is not limited to featured SaaS apps. Rather, it also supports custom and on-premises apps once onboarded, so the second statement is false. Moreover, you enable these controls via Microsoft Entra ID conditional access, which routes the session through the reverse proxy, hence configuration in Entra ID is required. Finally, admin roles are tenant-wide and not reassigned per application. Consequently, you do not re-grant roles just to use session control on a specific app. For example, an internal HR app published with App Proxy can have download blocked via session control without changing any admin roles, exactly as described here. Question 50. Arrange the steps performed during a Microsoft Defender for Endpoint Automated Investigation. Instruction: drag and drop the items into the correct order, starting with the first step at the top. Alert is triggered from a behavioral anomaly. Automated investigation begins using inspection algorithms. Relevant entities are examined and remediated if necessary. Investigation result and status are logged in the system. Admin reviews completed investigation in the console. I will now explain each answer. First, a behavioral anomaly raises the initial alert and kicks off the flow. Next, automated investigation runs inspection algorithms to gather evidence without analyst delay. Then, related entities such as files and services are examined and remediated where required to contain risk. Afterwards, results and status are logged, so the case is auditable and trackable. Finally, an admin reviews the completed investigation in the console to validate actions and take any follow-ups if needed. Question 51. For each Microsoft Defender Application Guard concept, drag it to the appropriate boxes in the correct match column to match it against its description in the option column. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Runs untrusted websites in an isolated Hyper-V container. Answer: isolated Hyper-V container. Helps prevent attackers from accessing enterprise credentials during browsing sessions. Answer: credential protection via isolation. Used to configure application guard settings for both Edge and Office. Answer: Microsoft Intune configuration profile. Applies to domain-joined desktops managed by Intune or Configuration Manager. Answer: Enterprise desktop. Cannot use application guard if system hardware does not support virtualization. Answer: hardware requirement enforcement. I will now explain each answer. First, Application Guard isolates untrusted sites inside a lightweight Hyper-V container, so the correct match is isolated Hyper-V container. Next, because the browser runs in that container, enterprise tokens and credentials are hidden from malicious pages. Therefore, this is credential protection via isolation. Then, admins manage the Edge and Office Application Guard settings centrally. Hence, Microsoft Intune configuration profile is used to deploy those configurations. Additionally, the intended target is centrally managed, domain-joined machines, so enterprise desktop is the appropriate device type. Finally, if virtualization isn't available, the feature cannot be enabled. Consequently, hardware requirement enforcement applies, blocking MDAG when the CPU or firmware lacks virtualization support. Question 52. Match each Windows Defender firewall with advanced security rule type to its correct function. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Allows or blocks traffic based on the program's executable path. Answer: program rule. Controls traffic using TCP or UDP port numbers. Answer, port rule. Uses IPsec to authenticate or encrypt network traffic. Answer, connection security rule. Allows firewall configuration based on Windows services or features. Answer, predefined rule. Isolates computers based on domain membership or health status. Answer, isolation rule. I will now explain each answer. First, a program rule targets a specific executable path, so regardless of port or protocol, you can allow or block that app's traffic, for example, permitting Outlook.exe while blocking a risky tool. Next, a port rule controls traffic on numbered TCP or UDP ports, thus you might open TCP 443 for HTTPS while keeping others closed. Then, a connection security rule doesn't pass traffic by itself. Rather, it enforces IPsec authentication or encryption between endpoints, ensuring trusted and private communication. Moreover, a predefined rule maps to Windows features like remote desktop or file and printer sharing, simplifying setup with service-aware settings. Finally, an isolation rule limits communication based on identity or health, so only domain-joined or compliant devices can talk to each other, effectively segmenting the network by trust level. Question 53. Which two statements accurately describe how EFS encrypts data? Select two answers. A. A symmetric key is used to encrypt the file content. B. The symmetric key is encrypted using the user's public key. C. The user's password is used as the encryption key. D. The private key is stored in Active Directory automatically. A. A symmetric key is used to encrypt the file content. B. The symmetric key is encrypted using the user's public key. I will now explain each answer. First, EFS creates a per-file symmetric key to encrypt the actual data because symmetric algorithms are fast for large files. Next, that symmetric key is itself encrypted with the user's public key and saved in the file header, so only the matching private key can unlock it. However, the user's password does not serve as the file's encryption key. Rather, it protects access to the private key and profile. Finally, the private key is not automatically stored in Active Directory unless key archival is explicitly configured with an enterprise CA, so by default it remains with the user profile. Question 54. Your company plans to configure WIP policies for desktop apps. You removed an app from the WIP protected list, but now users get access denied errors. What should you do to prevent this issue? Select one answer. A. Restart the WIP service on the endpoint. B. Reinstall the application or exempt it from the WIP policy. C. Add the app to the neutral boundary list. D. Reassign the policy to a different group. Correct answer B. Reinstall the application or exempt it from the WIP policy. I will now explain. First, when an app is removed from the protected list, its WIP state on the device can remain out of sync, which blocks enterprise tagged files. Reinstalling resets the app's permissions, and exempting the app tells WIP to allow it to open protected content. Next, restarting the WIP service does not change the per-app state, so the error persists. Moreover, the neutral boundary list applies to domains and network locations rather than applications, so it will not fix app behavior. Finally, reassigning the policy to another group does not modify the existing app state on devices. Therefore, it has no direct effect on the access denied issue. Question 55. Which two MBAM features improve enterprise support and recovery for BitLocker? Select two answers. A. Support for user-based EFS certificates. B. EFS rekeying wizard migration. C. End-user recovery through self-service portal. D. Auditing of recovery key access by admins. Correct answers. C. End-user recovery through self-service portal. D. Auditing of recovery key access by admins. I will now explain each answer. First, the self-service portal lets users recover their own BitLocker protected devices without calling IT, thereby speeding resolution and reducing help desk load. Next, auditing of recovery key access records who viewed or retrieved keys and when, thus improving accountability and compliance during recovery events. Conversely, Support for user-based EFS certificates is unrelated because MBAM manages BitLocker, not EFS. Similarly, the EFS rekeying wizard migration pertains to EFS features, not to MBAM's BitLocker recovery capabilities. Question 56. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Phased deployment communication planning should begin during pilot planning. Answer: true. IT should delay user training until help desk tickets begin to rise. False. Communications are more effective when supported by department managers. Fiscal quarter end is a good time to deploy major updates to finance teams. Answer: false. I will now explain each answer. First, planning communications during the pilot ensures readiness across phases and sets expectations early. Therefore, it is true. However, delaying training until tickets spike is reactive and raises risk, so proactive training makes the second statement false. Moreover, manager-backed messages carry trust and drive participation. Consequently, the third statement is true. Finally, major rollouts should avoid peak business periods like quarter, close to reduce disruption. Hence, the last statement is false. Question 57. For each statement below, indicate whether the answer is true or false. Boot from VHD allows Windows to run as if it were installed on physical hardware. Answer: true. Hyper-V is required to deploy thick images in enterprise environments. Answer: false. DSM can be used to apply Windows images to a VHD file. Answer: true. Imaging was the standard method of OS deployment before Windows 11. Answer: true. I will now explain each answer. First, booting from a VHD runs Windows natively on the device using the VHD as the system disk, so it behaves like a normal install without touching the physical drive. Therefore, true. Next, Hyper-V is a virtualization feature and not a prerequisite for thick image deployment. Enterprises can deploy thick images with tools like MDT or ConfigMgr without Hyper-V, hence false. Moreover, DSM includes commands to apply and service WIM images directly to VHD files, so administrators can build bootable VHDs with DSM, thus true. Finally, before modern provisioning tools became widespread, traditional imaging was the common way to deploy Windows at scale, so the historical statement stands as true. Question 58. Fill in the blanks by selecting the correct options from the drop-down menus. In-place upgrades must use the standard Windows image located in the install.wim file on the installation media. I will now explain each answer. First, Microsoft only supports in-place upgrades when the base is the standard Windows image, because custom captures can introduce drivers and settings that break the upgrade flow. Next, the supported operating system image resides in install.wim on official media. Therefore, pointing the tasks sequence or setup to that file ensures compatibility with the upgrade engine. Moreover, WinRe or recovery partitions are for repair scenarios, not full OS upgrades, so they are inappropriate here. For example, when upgrading Windows 10 to Windows 11 at scale, you mount the ISO and reference sources install.wim rather than a bespoke image, consequently minimizing failures and keeping the deployment in a supported state. Question 59. For each in-place upgrade limitation, drag it to the appropriate boxes in the correct match column to match it against its description in the option column. Each item may be used once, more than once, or not at all. Cannot upgrade between different system languages. Answer: language mismatch. Cannot be used for upgrading systems that boot from VHD or Windows to Go media. Answer: VHD Windows to Go. Cannot upgrade from 32-bit to 64-bit versions of Windows. Answer: 32-bit to 64-bit upgrade. Cannot be used for dual boot or multi-boot configurations. Answer: dual boot or multi-boot setup. I will now explain each answer. First, in-place upgrades require the OS language to remain the same. Therefore, a language mismatch, such as Spanish to English, blocks the upgrade. Next, devices that boot from VHD or Windows to Go use special boot configurations, so the setup engine does not support upgrading those environments. Moreover, you cannot switch CPU architecture during an in-place upgrade. Consequently, moving from 32-bit to 64-bit needs a clean install instead. Finally, systems configured for dual boot or multi-boot are not supported by in-place upgrades. Thus, they must be reconfigured or clean installed to proceed. Question 60. Arrange the phases of the in-place upgrade process using Windows setup in the correct order. Instruction: drag and drop the items into the correct order, starting with the first step at the top. Run setup.exe with compatibility scan. Perform pre-installation checks. Preserve apps and user data. Complete upgrade or roll back if needed. I will now explain each answer. First, you start setup.exe and run the compatibility scan to surface blockers before any system changes occur. Next, Windows performs pre-installation checks for items like edition, language, disk space, and power so the upgrade can proceed safely. Then once cleared, the setup engine preserves existing apps, settings, and user data, which is the hallmark of an in-place upgrade. Finally, the process completes the upgrade or, if a late failure happens, automatically rolls back to the previous OS to keep the device usable. For example, upgrading a field laptop will flag an incompatible driver during the scan, verify resources in the checks, carry the user's profiles forward, and either finish successfully or revert cleanly if something breaks near the end.